Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 31 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Los Angeles Kings, in which the Sharks have won 4-2. So they now extend their winning streak to 2 games and have completed the sweep of the little 2-game series against the Los Angeles Kings here. And I'm sort of thinking about these past couple of games and seeing as though there may be a bit of positive karma after the strong sort of games that they had put up in the previous ones against the Vegas Golden Knights and the St. Louis Blues, which didn't necessarily result in too many points for themselves, because in these past couple of games, while they did manage to claim all 4 of a possible 4 points, as well as leaving the Kings with none, these were 2 games that they were heavily outshot, and you could say maybe even at times outplayed as well, giving up over 40 shots in both of these games. This one started off pretty even in the first period, I guess you could say. The Kings had the majority of the shots, the majority of the chances, but after 20 minutes, it was a tie game between these two teams. Going into the second period, finally a team would strike. It would be the San Jose Sharks. They'd get a goal from Balcers, his 3rd of the season, and eventually Evander Kane would add to that to make it 2-0. However, in the dying seconds of the second period, Alex Iafallo would manage to score for the Kings to cut the Sharks' lead in half, and we would head into the intermission with a 2-1 Sharks lead. And of course, this was pretty nerve-wracking, I guess you could say, from a fan perspective. The past few third periods for the San Jose Sharks have not gone particularly well, and it's always not a very good thing to give up a goal in the last few seconds of a period, because you give the team who managed to score that goal all the momentum and all the belief in themselves that they can come out immediately in the third period and get things rolling for themselves. But not only do the Sharks manage to prevent the Kings from actually getting anything rolling early on in the third period, but the Sharks themselves really put themselves up in a good position early in the third by adding a goal within just the first few seconds of it from Evander Kane, his 2nd of the night, and then just a couple minutes later getting one from Tomas Hertl to make it 4-1 San Jose quickly, and trying to squash any of the comeback potential that the Kings looked to be having at the end of that second period. The Kings would get one back, and actually only a couple minutes later within the first few minutes of the third period, to make it 4-2, but that would be the end of the scoring for the Los Angeles Kings in this game. In fact, it would be in the last couple of minutes of this third period where Logan Couture would be shooting towards the empty net, and he'd actually get a hit from Jeff Carter that looked clean on the surface, but in the end it seemed as though Jeff Carter did get potentially the butt end of his stick, or maybe the top of the shaft of his stick, up into the face of Couture, causing him to go down on the ice hard. I would hope that it's more sort of just the impact that Couture faced that obviously kept him out for the last couple of minutes of this game and kept him down on the ice for those extra few seconds, and that he will be fine moving forward, because obviously if that's not the case, that would be really bad for the San Jose Sharks. Logan Couture has been one of the more consistent forwards for the Sharks. He is now he's currently tied for the team lead in goals because of Kane's couple of goals here tonight. But in the end, the Sharks get rewarded a power play in those last couple of minutes. The Kings, for whatever reason, don't pull their goalie on said power play, and the Sharks close out the victory 4-2. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones back in nets here tonight after his great performance in the previous game against the Kings, and he repeats that performance here tonight, now with 4 straight games in a row of very good performances here from Martin Jones. This is the first of those 4 games where he gave up more than 1 goal, with the 2 here tonight, but he was still spectacular. Didn't have much of a chance at all on this Alex Iafallo tip. Very nice tip from him, as well as not much of a chance at all on the Adrian Kempe goal either, considering it was pretty poor defensive coverage by the Sharks and a spectacular sort of singular play from Drew Doughty to set up Kempe for that one. Otherwise, Jones made multiple massive saves for the San Jose Sharks. And I think a really good way to look at this one was that we actually saw Martin Jones make a pretty huge save when the Sharks were up 1-0, and then just a few moments later the Sharks would actually go the other way and get the goal from Evander Kane to make it 2-0 San Jose. And you can imagine when Jones was playing more poorly this season, which is the majority of the season thus far, besides these few games that he's just had in a row now. That's a situation where Jones maybe lets in that goal. The game is tied at 1-1, and we have a completely different finish to this one, but because he manages to make the save, Kane is able to respond on the transition, on the rush, to make it 2-0, and the Sharks end up closing it out 4-2. So great game from Martin Jones. When we come up to the next game, which will be on Friday, Jones may or may not get the start. The reason being is, of course, this is yet another weekend back-to-back, both games against the Arizona Coyotes. So even if Jones does not get the game on Friday, he will get the one on Saturday. And if Jones does get the one on Friday, then it will be Dubnyk in on Saturday. So Jones will get one or the other, and we'll hope that the streak can continue. Next, just a brief mention of Evander Kane. Of course, the 2 goals here tonight, as I said, puts him now tied for the team lead in terms of goal on the season with 14. And there was actually a very interesting stat that I saw here today that Evander Kane actually has the most goals for the Sharks since he arrived to the team in February of the 17-18 season. Now, this stat necessarily isn't super surprising considering the fact that Couture isn't much of a goal scorer for the San Jose Sharks. Pavelski left and hasn't been here for this season as well as the last one. Tomas Hertl has been injured a lot. Timo Meier has not had as great of a season, since that 18-19 breakout year for himself. So I don't necessarily know who else would have been the player to be here, but it's still interesting to see that it is, of course, Evander Kane. I believe it was with 78 or so goals since that time. And so it just goes to show that the contract for Evander Kane is still very solid for himself. A lot of people, especially on the outside of the Sharks, fandom, look at this contract and they think of Evander Kane sort of like still a decently skilled player, but a bit of a goon himself, I guess you could say, because of all the penalty minutes he racks up, and of course the drama he can get into at times off the ice. So a lot of people think that paying him $7 million a year isn't that great and is actually not a great contract at all. But us Sharks fans absolutely know that Kane has been, if not one of the best forwards for the San Jose Sharks, if not the best forward, if not the best player for the Sharks this season, and he continued to show that here tonight, showing up when it mattered. Next, we'll be talking about Dylan Gambrell, a player who I haven't mentioned too many times this season. He's had sort of a strange one where at times he's been a player who Booner has leaned on pretty significantly, getting a ton of time on ice and playing on the penalty kill and playing defensively, and at times he's been, a healthy scratch even. And it's been mostly because his offensive game has not nearly progressed as well as the Sharks were likely hoping for. They were not expecting Dylan Gambrell to be a 30-goal scorer. They probably weren't even expecting him to be a 20-goal scorer, but they were at least expecting him to maybe be able to get 10 to 15 over a full 82-game season. And at the moment, he has just 2, which would, of course, only put him on pace for about 6 or 7 over a full season, which is obviously not that great. However, Gambrell recently in the past few games has definitely been picking it up somewhat offensively, not just by getting a goal here or there. I believe his last goal was a couple games ago against St. Louis Blues or the Vegas Golden Knights. That ended up being the case. However, it also has just been the general progression in the offensive zone where he's been looking a lot better. The third line here tonight was a bit up and down. It had its moments where it looked quite solid offensively. Balcers obviously scored here tonight. Sorensen looked pretty decent offensively, though defensively it did leave a bit to be desired. Sorensen had a few really big critical mistakes. One of them being on the Adrian Kempe goal that would eventually make it 4-2 for the Los Angeles Kings. But otherwise, Gambrell has been doing a pretty decent job centering that third line, and the offense has been progressing, and of course the defense was always really there. And finally, I'll talk about Radim Shemek. So I've mentioned, Carlson and Burns a lot of times this season, and recently I've mentioned Nizov, I've mentioned Vlasic, just in the previous game I mentioned Ferraro, but I haven't been mentioning much of Radim Shemek. Shemek has been a very interesting player, honestly, to talk about, actually, just because back at the start of this season, it was said, after a 10-month period, you expected Shemek to be 100% healthy after that big injury that he sustained a couple years ago, but it was actually said that was seemingly a lingering issue for him, and it so much has resulted in him not actually playing the first 2 games of this season. However, since then, he has been in the lineup every single night, but he has never really returned to that former glory, I guess you could say, he had previously. Now, a big part of that is obviously because prior he was playing with Brent Burns, and so he was sort of playing a good amount of minutes because he was always on the ice with Brent Burns, and now Ferraro has filled in that spot on that top pairing. But another reason definitely could be maybe maybe this injury is somewhat holding him back and preventing him from actually getting a ton of ice time. Because I thought Šimek's game here tonight was actually pretty decent. It wasn't fantastic, but it never really is. Šimek is just a solid defensive player, and it was a solid defensive performance from him here tonight. But I wonder if that knee issue is actually something that is still lingering and is still bothering him, and if that's maybe a reason why he's not getting, so much penalty killing time, so much time on ice. Because while it somewhat makes sense for Vlasic to be someone getting consistent 15 to 16 minutes a night, because he has fallen off pretty significantly from where he once was a few years ago, when it comes to Radim Šimek, it was only last year or a couple of seasons ago that Šimek was actually looking quite good on that top pairing. And the fact that he's now on the third pairing and not really getting too many minutes a night could be a byproduct of the fact that the Sharks do have a lot of big defensemen to give minutes to: Ferraro, Burns, Carlson. But it could also be something with that injury potentially still holding him back. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Friday as they'll take on the Arizona Coyotes, a team they have not played since the first couple of games of this season. So we'll see. We'll get a completely different look of the Coyotes than what we saw early on. The Coyotes will get a completely different look from what they saw early on from the Sharks. And we'll see if the Sharks can keep the winning streak going. Class dismissed.